Hey there, students. So this week we're going to go over three really important theories within deviance. And so just to remember or just to reiterate, a theory is simply an explanation for crime. And they help us make sense of, what might be going on. So the first one we're going to look at is Robert Merton and his theory of social structure and anomie. This is also known as strain theory. In some textbooks, they'll call it strain theory. So just in case you hear it referred to it that way, and not to be confused with general strain theory, which is another one. But when it came to Merton's theory, he really looked at how society was set up. And so he's referencing this idea of social structure. He looks at the goals and the means of achieving those goals within the social structure. So, under capitalism, most of the goals would be associated with finances or making money. There's also ideas of status that come along with this, right? Like, so think about the goals that society sets up for us. They are oftentimes really framed by living in a capitalistic country. So, make lots of money, get lots of status, those types of things. But of course, not all individuals have access or what Merton said, had the means of achieving those goals. So, for instance, society says make lots of money, but maybe you didn't go to a great school, and so you don't really feel like you have the opportunities or connections in order to, make $200,000 a year. And so Merton said that when people are experiencing this strain within the culture, within the society, they will adapt in four different or five different ways. And these are known as typologies. And we'll go over those in just a second here. So before we move on to the typologies, just to kind of go again across some of these main principles. So again, Merton said that crime is not like an individual thing, but rather it's rooted in the way society is made up. And so the types of crimes that we see under capitalism are going to be very different than maybe a country that uses a different economic setup. We'll also look at how deviance occurs when a society does not offer access or equal access to achieve acceptable goals. So we have these ideas right within the culture that you're supposed to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Anyone can do it. This is the American dream. But of course, we know that, access to things like a good education, even connections that your parents might be able to, bring you, and like just, the class that you live in. So, do your parents' friends have, can they offer you a job at some really nice establishment, or are you, can they offer you a job here, or maybe there are no jobs, right? Because they don't have a lot of power or status themselves. And so we can really look at how certain individuals are really left out of these economic systems. And Merton will talk about how they adapt when they are experiencing what he called anomie, or kind of a sense of normlessness of not being able to achieve these goals within a society that really puts a lot of emphasis on that. So he believed that it was the social structure, not the individual, that exerted pressure for people to engage in non-conforming behavior. And that might be, for instance, maybe you're a father and there's this idea under gendered lines that you're supposed to be providing for your family. And so maybe you decide, working at McDonald's is not getting us anywhere. I'm gonna go sell drugs. I can make 10 times as much. I get to choose my schedule. And you might get some status along with that job as well. And so, again, we're not saying it's the right thing to do, but where this gives us some understanding as to why certain individuals will adapt in certain ways. So here's the basic kind of setup for strain theory. And again, you'll see it called strain theory in many, many books. So just try not to get it confused. In our book, they call it structural and anomie theory. Most of the time, it's called string theory. So I'm not really sure what they're doing there. So if you hear me refer to it as strain theory, think of it. Make sure you're, thinking of this one. So, Merton said that when individuals are like living within the society, when they have access to the means or to the goals of society, they'll be okay. But when people are experiencing a sense of normlessness, they will either adapt or respond in various ways. So the first person is the conformist. The conformist is someone who accepts the goals of society, right? But they also accept the means of achieving those goals. So a conformist does, what everybody does. It's in the name. They accept the means, they accept the goals. An example of a conformist would be someone who's kind of experiencing this and they say, okay, I'm going to go back to school. I'm going to get my degree and then I'm going to get that really great job, right? So they're going down the road that most people go down, right? But of course, Merton said that not everyone had access to all of these means of achieving those goals. And in fact, when some of those avenues are closed, he said that a new kind of typology would emerge, and that would be the innovator. And the innovator still really has these goals. They still want this stuff, but they don't necessarily use socially acceptable means to achieve them. So this is really kind of your stereotypical person who turns to crime. It doesn't have to be always, but generally it is. So it's that, person who's like, okay, I'm going to go sell drugs so I can, have all of this stuff. I can have the money. I can have, the resources that I need. Right, so the innovator comes up with a new way of doing something. They don't always have to turn to crime. They might turn to doing something just totally different, right? So, for instance, oftentimes people kind of cite Bill Gates as being an innovator, right? He, decided to build something in his garage, drop out of school, build something in his garage. So he definitely went against, what we see with the conformist. He was more of an innovator. The next typology that Merton came up with was the ritualist. And the ritualist is really interesting. This is a person who has the they have access to the means, but they don't necessarily have the same goals as society. And sometimes I think these are, some of the happiest people, but I think in terms of looking at his theory, because we're so part of this culture that it's hard for us to even understand someone who wouldn't want a bunch of money or, have these goals. But the ritualist generally doesn't have these goals of wealth and, prosperity. It's more of like someone who ritually goes to work. They're not trying to be the CEO. Maybe they are really smart. They could do it, but they're not doing it, right? And so they kind of reject the goals of society, but they're still ritually going through the process. And so this, an example of this might be someone who, again, is just perfectly content working, just an average job. They don't need to be CEO or anything like that. The next typology that Merton came up with was the retreatist. The retreatist is someone who doesn't accept the goals or the means of achieving those goals. Generally, these are people who are going to retreat from society. So you might see, people who are homeless by choice, kind of giving up on the whole system overall. They're definitely not using the means and not like working towards the goals. So you see this with like a lot of addiction, people who are just giving up. And I know addiction is a lot more complex than that. So I want to be really, really clear with that. But we're looking at people who are just really kind of, again, retreating from society, not really wanting to be a part of it anymore. Lastly, we have our rebel, or sometimes it's referred to as an anarchist, but these are people who are really challenging the existing or approved goals, as well as the existing and approved means. And a lot of the time, these people are ones who are trying to come up with new ways of doing things. And so, even though these two people are very different, someone like Martin Luther King and Osama bin Laden would both be considered rebels. Of course, the socially acceptable means of achieving those goals are going to be very, very different, but they have a new idea or new social order. And, when it comes down to kind of looking at it, sometimes they accept the means, sometimes they don't. So if you look at someone like Martin Luther King, he used peaceful protests as a way to get his points across, right? But his goals were all new. It was a new form of system. Osama bin Laden also had new ideas for, systemic goals and change. Of course, his means of achieving those goals were very violent and dangerous. And so we can kind of look at those very, very differently. But again, both of these individuals are considered rebels in the big kind of picture of it because they are rejecting the goals of society. Sometimes they use the means, sometimes they don't. So these are the five typologies I was talking about. And again, this is how people will respond when they're experiencing some type of strain, experiencing some type of anomie in terms of not being able to achieve the socially appropriate goals. All right, the next theory we're going to be looking at is differential association. And it was Edwin Sutherland and Cressy who came up with this theory. I will say this is one of the most famous theories in sociology, and part of that, or criminology, part of that is because it's so simple and it's likely that you've already kind of used this theory in your own life without even realizing it. They were just the smart ones to write it down, right? And so I usually tell students, when looking at differential association, this is a learning theory, so it's micro, but we're essentially saying that individuals will learn either conforming behavior or non-conforming behavior based on the intimate groups that they're hanging out with. So I always tell students, you are who you hang out with, right? If you've ever had parents who are like, I don't want you hanging out with that kid, it's really based on this idea of differential association. And so, even though it's a really simple theory, he did break it down into like 9 different layers. I kind of broke it down, kind of combined them into 4 for you just to make it a little bit more, because again, it's a really simple theory. Maybe they just needed a bunch of stuff to write down. But just to give you some more clarification in terms of, some of the specifics. So, one of the main ideas was crime or deviance or even conforming behavior is learned through communication within intimate groups. And again, I keep saying conforming behavior is also learned. And so, I always tell students, if you want to be a straight A student, hang out with straight A students, right? Because the norms and the expectations and the way they do things will start kind of shedding off, will start, rubbing off on you. It's one of the best things you can do. But, in terms of crime, we also say that, people will learn crime and deviance in the same way that they learn any type of behavior. And that also includes learning techniques and rationalizations for that as well. So I told you I would share some with you, some of my deviance in my past. When I was, I think I was around 12 or 13, my best friend and I were shoplifting. And I'm not blaming it on her at all, but I'm just explaining how she actually taught me the techniques. Like she showed me, I watched her do it first. I'm not sure these techniques were so professional at all, but I watched the way she did it and then I kind of followed. But also, we also learned rationalizations for some of these techniques. We felt okay stealing from big stores. We wouldn't steal from like small places. Some of those rationalizations were, hey, these big box stores, I've already accounted for things like shrinkage or they take enough of my money as it is when I shop there. People make all different types of rationalizations. But what's important in terms of this theory is that those rationalizations are learned just like, the attitudes and techniques and everything else. And of course, the more, the third point here is like the more you are exposed to excessive definitions that are favorable to law violation, the more you are likely to, take that on yourself. And so really think about it. Consider someone who maybe grew up amongst like family who were, I don't know, all in a gang or something like that. You can see how, this is all they ever knew. And if grandpa and grandma and dad and mom and siblings are all in the gang, you could totally understand why they are more likely to favor, like, pull out a favorable ideas around this type of behavior, as opposed to like you grow up with all law abiding people. You can see why it might be kind of weird to start turning to a gang when that's not how you grew up. So again, we're just looking at how these everyday interactions come to influence people's decision making around crime and deviance. And lastly, Sutherland and Cressy said that it varies in terms of frequency or how often you're hanging out with these people. Are you living with them? Duration, that just means how long you're with them each time. Priority, how important they are to you. Is this your favorite uncle, or is this that uncle that you never really liked to begin with, right? If it's your favorite uncle, you're more likely to adopt his behaviors, right? And then intensity, right? Same ideas of, how often you're doing this, how often you're around it. All of these are going to influence, again, if this is your world, if you're living with people whose attitudes are this way and they believe, that intensely about these ideas, that's definitely going to kind of shut off on your own decision making. All right, so the next theory that we'll be looking at comes from chapter 9, and this is Control Theory by Travis Hershey. What's going to be a little bit different with this theory is it's a social control theory, which control theories are looking not at why people commit crime, but also, or mostly, why most people don't commit crime. Because you have to remember, even in really bad areas, most people are law abiding. And so we'll look at things like internal control mechanisms, things that keep people from committing crime. And you might think of this as you just reflect on your own life. We've talked about the idea that maybe many of us know that we could get away with things, but we choose not to because we have this sense of self, right? We want to feel like we're good members of society. We want to feel good about ourselves morally. We don't want to be laying in bed at night, worried about some action that we've met. And maybe that has to do with, how we are bonded to society, right? Or maybe you have too much at stake to be playing around with crime or deviance, right? So Travis Hershey came up with these 4 dimensions or elements of the bonds. And again, we're talking about social bonds. So we're saying that the stronger your social bonds are to society, the less likely you are to engage in crime and deviance. And he broke this into 4 different sections. The first one looked at attachment. And it said that people with a stronger attachment to others are going to be less likely, and the opposite is true as well. So, oftentimes we see people kind of age out of crime, and part of that is because they build bonds, right? So maybe they get married, maybe they have children. I always have this vision of my head of when I lived in SoCal. I was on my way to work one day, and there was this guy who looked like, he had lived the gang lifestyle. He had tattoos all over his face, all over his body. He was in, you could see all of his arms and everything. And I remember, and he's pushing this little baby down the road, really cute little kid in a stroller. And it just really made me think about this. And I don't know anything about his life story or whatever, but here you have this guy who clearly was, part of a very different lifestyle in his past, taking on this new role and new bond as a father. And you can see why many people, parenthood changes your life beyond anything, right? Even things like I'm not going to go out to the bar and drink anymore because I'm like, I have a kid at home, right? I want to set a good example, but I have an attachment to her. It's an internal control, and this is just, it's our stake in conformity. We're like, man, these people are really important to me. I wouldn't want to kind of put that on the line. The next one has to do with our commitment. And a commitment is kind of an idea that we have like, hey, I'm committed to being part of this society. I'm committed to being a good person. And again, these commitments are based on like, we're committed to conventionality, or the conventional line of thinking or doing. So we're going to more so conform to what we believe is really, really important. So I'm committed to living in a system that I believe in. And I wouldn't want to do anything to jeopardize my like chances within that system. The next the next dimension that Travis Hershey looked at was called involvement. And essentially, what we're saying is that the more involved you are, or the more bonds you have in terms of your involvement in the community, the less likely you are to turn to crime and deviance. And you may have had some of your parents kind of Think about this as they were raising you. Maybe in high school, they got you involved in 10 different things after school. And, along research lines, that's very, very smart. The busier you are, the less likely you are to, turn to crime or deviance. And so, opportunities, conventional opportunities, people see as very satisfying. And the more you have, the more bonds you have to those different opportunities, the less likely you are to be offending. And again, it goes the other way with all of these, right? So you don't have a lot of involvement, you don't have a lot of commitment, maybe you don't believe in the system. You're like, this system is totally screwed, it's been set up against me. Well, that, we understand where that rationalization comes from, and we understand why, someone might go, F this system, I'm gonna do my own thing. Or why someone might engage in crime and deviance after they've, in terms of attachment, after they've lost someone they loved, right? Think about like a teenager who loses their parents. We can totally understand why they might, engage in crime and deviance. They don't have those social bonds. They are broken or weak or gone. Lastly, the idea of belief, right? So we either get beliefs that, crime is wrong or crime is okay. This goes along that idea of differential association, which is what we talked about. But, the belief refers to this idea that we all have a stake in this kind of common value system that we see in society, right? That we all believe in them, and we don't want we don't want the norms violated. We also, it goes to this idea of what we believe is good or bad, what's desirable or undesirable. And the stronger your beliefs are to, this system, or the weaker they are, that will influence your perceptions of whether it's okay to, engage in crime and deviance. So again, social control theories, they're helping us understand, how these social bonds might influence people to not commit crime or to turn to crime, right? Depending on where they fall along these four dimensions or bonds.